This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Alabama, where a prisoner, Anthony Ray Hinton, was released Friday after spending nearly 30 years on death row.
For all of us that say that we believe in justice, this is the case to start showing. Because I shouldn't have sit on death row 30 years. All they had to do was test the gun. But when you think you're high and mighty and you're above the law, you don't have to answer to nobody. But I got news for you. Everybody that played a part in sending me to death row, you will answer to God. That's all I have to say right now.
Anthony Ray Hinton was convicted of murdering 2 fast food managers in separate robberies in 1985. He was 29 years old at the time. The only evidence linking Hinton to the crimes were bullets that allegedly had markings matching a revolver that belonged to Hinton's mother. There were no fingerprints or eyewitness testimony. After Hinton was convicted, subsequent tests found the bullets at the scene could not be matched to the gun he was accused of using. Last year, the U.S. Supreme Court threw out his conviction, concluding Hinton had been inadequately represented at trial. Hinton could not afford a defense lawyer. His court-appointed attorney used as a witness a firearms expert he knew to be incompetent. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, which won his release, Hinton is among the longest-serving death row prisoners ever to be freed after presenting evidence of innocence. We go now to Montgomery, Alabama, where we're joined by Anthony Ray Hinton himself, just freed, as well as Bryan Stevenson, founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, the attorney who has worked on death row penalty cases in the Deep South for decades and represented Anthony Ray Hinton since 1999. He's the author of the book Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption. His book was just nominated for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence, run by the American Library Association. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Anthony Hinton, let's begin with you. How does it feel to be free?
Oh, it feels wonderful. A little scary at that time, especially when I've been out to the malls, and I'm not used to being around that many people at a certain setting.
Where were you, Anthony, in prison when you heard that you would be freed? When was it?
I was out in the day room at the Birmingham Jefferson County Jail, and just had got through talking to one of the attorneys from EJI, and he told me to call Mr. Stevenson right away. And I called Mr. Stevenson, and Mr. Stevenson gave me the news, the wonderful news.
Bryan Stevenson, why did you take on this case? How did you hear about Anthony Ray Hinton in prison at the point you took it on? I mean, he was freed after 30 years. How did you hear about the case?
Well, we actually monitor almost all of the cases involving people sentenced to death here in Alabama. There is no public defender system. There is no right to counsel. We've got people on death row here who are literally dying for legal assistance. And so we're pretty familiar with all of the cases. We had recruited some lawyers to represent Mr. Hinton, but it's a very difficult thing to take on. If you don't have a lot of resources and if you're far away, it's hard. So we had known about the case for some time. Mr. Hinton and I had actually met many years earlier. When his lawyers could no longer represent him, we decided to take the case on, and I got personally involved. And I just have to say how extraordinary it is to be sitting next to my friend and my client. We've spent so many hours together at home in prison, but we've never been able to sit together in suits in a place like this, and I have to say it's an extraordinary, extraordinary feeling.
So, Bryan, can you explain this case? You took it on in 1999. Go back to 1985 and what happened, what evidence wasn't presented, what evidence was presented.
Well, in many ways, this is a very powerful demonstration of the critique of the American criminal justice system, which we contend treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. There was a great deal of concern in the community because these restaurant managers had been murdered. They had these bullets. They falsely claimed that these bullets could be linked to a single weapon. They then falsely claimed that that weapon was Mr. Hinton's. Because his lawyer was only paid $1,600 to represent him. He couldn't get an expert that was competent to disprove that. He got someone who was visually impaired, a civil engineer, and the jury convicted Mr. Hinton. You know, had he had the resources to get the kind of legal help he needed, he would have never been convicted. The real problem was years later when we developed the evidence that showed that these bullets could not be matched to a single gun and that it wasn't Mr. Hinton's gun. The state then refused for 16 years to even retest the evidence. And that, for me, was the most distressing part of this case. It was indifference, it was irresponsible, it was really unconscionable that they chose to risk executing an innocent person over risking the perception that they were somehow making a mistake or not being tough on crime. And they fought us tooth and nail, and I have to say it was quite an unlikely and rare occurrence that we could get the United States Supreme Court to intervene when we did. Had they not intervened, I think the risk of a wrongful execution would have been very, very high. There's been no accountability. The experts have not been held accountable. The prosecutors have not been held accountable. There's been no apology. There's been no offer of any kind of assistance. And I think this case is a really shameful example of all the reforms that are desperately needed. I might also say, Amy, that race was a factor here, too. I can't leave that out. The investigators who worked on this case had been previously charged in federal court for torturing black prisoners. They'd been using cattle prods to coerce statements out of black prisoners. The prosecutor claimed that Mr. Hinton was innocent. By looking at him, he said he could tell he was evil just by looking at his face. That prosecutor had been reversed many times for excluding African Americans from serving on juries. And Mr. Hinton was convicted in part because of the burden of the presumption of guilt that gets assigned to too many black and brown people in this country when they're accused of a crime.
Now, Anthony Ray Hinton, you were on death row for nearly 30 years. Did you ever face an execution date?
No, I didn't. Thank God I didn't ever face the execution date. I thought about it a lot of time, but like I stated before, I just had faith that God would not let me be executed for something that I didn't do.
Before 1999, that was well over a decade after you were imprisoned on death row, before EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, Bryan Stevenson, took your case on. Did you ever think that your verdict would be overturned? Who could you appeal to?
Well, to be honest with you, when you is placed on death row, you have to have strong faith. And the lawyer that I had that represented me during trial, once the case go through the Alabama Criminal Court Appeal and you lose there, you on your own. So I had wrote Mr. Stevenson and asked for assistance from them, and he got me an attorney out of Boston. And to be honest with you, the lawyer that from Boston come down and talked to me, and he stayed on the case maybe a year or so, a couple of years, and it just wasn't working out in the way that I thought the case should be going. And I remember specifically that he told me he was trying to get me a life without. And I told him, get that for someone that is guilty. I'm innocent. I need someone that would believe in me and would fight for my life as hard as they could. And that's where Mr. Stevenson and them came in.
And this issue of money, I mean, the ballistics expert, explain his limited vision, let alone his incompetence. And was money the key issue here, Anthony? Being able to hire a competent ballistics expert?
Yes, money was very important. Not only the expert that I have at the time of my trial, he was blind in one eye. When he went to the forensic science to check the gun, he didn't even know how to turn on the basic machine. He had to ask for help to turn on the machine. And that should have been a red flag for those men that's sitting there watching and watching this man ask for help. And not only did that, he said once he got up under the microscope, all he could see was his finger. So he testified in court that he had very limited eyesight. He had very limited in the telescope that he was using. I just don't understand how a judge of anyone could qualify him as being an expert. And they kept using the term, what he know more than the average person. I think it's some laws need to be changed around here. Just because you read a magazine about surgery don't mean I can come up to New York and give you an open heart surgery. And so this is what we need to try to change in Alabama. People just getting up on the stand and testifying and considering themselves an expert.
How did you maintain the sense of humor you have, Anthony? I mean, you were well respected by both the guards on death row and also other prisoners.
Oh, yes. I think I was born with this sense of humor. And that's something that 20, 30 years that they took from me, they couldn't take my soul. They couldn't take the fact that I love to make people laugh. I think you can find humor in anything. And I use that as a tool to make other people forget their problem. I think it was my biggest asset that I had, that having a sense of humor. I recall sometime just sitting up there and a correction officer would come by and I said, hey, I need to go home for an hour and I promise you I'll come right back. Just different little stuff that I would say every day. They try to get myself through it, and as well as my other inmates that were surrounded with me.
Bryan Stevenson, the state's evidence of a match discredited by 3 highly qualified firearms examiners, including the former chief of the FBI's Firearm and Tool Marks Unit, who testified in 2002 that the bullets from all 3 crimes could not be matched to a single gun at all, much less to Anthony's mother's gun. 2002, when you talk about they just wouldn't review it, aren't there laws that say you have to review exonerating evidence? I mean, the Supreme Court unanimously overturned the verdict.
No, you're absolutely right, Amy. But no, there aren't those kinds of laws. We rely on the integrity of prosecutors and the integrity of law enforcement officials to do what's required. And in this case, there was an absence of integrity. There was an absence of leadership. There was an absence of goodwill. And that's the challenge that we face right now. Mr. Hinton is the 152nd person to be exonerated after being sentenced to death. That means for every 9 people who've been executed in this country, we've now identified 1 innocent person. And if we had integrity, we'd stop executing people until we dealt with these problems of unreliability. But that's what was missing in this case. We went to every attorney general in the state of Alabama during 4 administrations. We repeatedly asked the prosecutor, and they just decided to see if they could get away with holding on to this conviction. And it really is shameful, because while Mr. Hinton is a remarkable human being who had just incredible resolve, he was on death row when 53 other people were executed. They took them just a few feet from where he was housed and put them in the electric chair and strapped them on gurneys, and they tried to kill him every day of his time on death row. And I still think we've got great challenges. There are some parts of the country that have created conviction integrity units. We don't have them in Alabama. And I'd love to see the Supreme Court actually create some requirements that would make it easier for us to insist on the kind of testing we were denied for 16 years.
You were the 152nd person to be exonerated from death row, Anthony Ray Hinton. When you came outside, your first reaction to standing outside on the other side of the bars?
Thanking God all alone, seeing so many cameras and families and friends. It was a long time. But I just felt so relieved at knowing that I was finally
being free for something that I've been telling people, streaming to people that I didn't do. And it was a feeling like I never felt before. And I can't really explain it to you, perhaps where you can understand it. But from where I've been for 30 years, just to be able to come out and knowing that I wasn't going to have to be locked back up, it's just an amazing feeling.
Your mother died in 2002 when you were in prison.
Yes.
Were you able to visit her grave when you left?
Yes, I went to her grave. That was my rock. That was everything I had. And I would have loved being able to say, they finally got it right, Mama. And I'm home. I know she would have been the happiest person. She probably would have cooked me all my favorites. And we would have just sit down and hugged. And I know she wouldn't have let me left, and I definitely wouldn't have left her arms. When you come up, my mother had to be my father. My father lost his mind when I was very young. And my mother instilled in us to do the right thing at all times. And she was just an extremely ordinary woman. And I loved her more than life itself. And I just felt that I owed it to her to fight as hard as I could because she didn't raise no killer. And I thank God that he brought me through. And I'm pretty sure that she's jumping around in heaven saying, thank you, Jesus.
Bryan Stevenson, what about compensation? Anthony Ray Hinton was on death row for 30 years before he was freed, an innocent man.
Well, there's no amount of money that can totally compensate you for that. They took something from him that they don't have the power to give back. But I think they ought to want to initiate anything they can do to pay for some of the outrageous injustice that this case creates. But I think if there's going to really be any kind of meaningful response to this, not only should he be compensated, but people should be held accountable. People should apologize. People should do some soul searching. We should create some procedures that mandate that when there's evidence that suggests the person has been wrongly convicted, that evidence has to be reviewed. Mr. Hinton passed a polygraph test when he was first arrested. He was locked in a warehouse working when one of these crimes took place, and they simply ignored that. And we need to change those procedures. The Supreme Court has actually immunized prosecutors and law enforcement officers and judges. And the Thompson case that was decided a couple of years ago, I think that's a wrongly decided decision that should be changed. We've got to incentivize greater commitment and responsibility in these kinds of cases. And then finally, I think there has to be the creation of the kind of integrity conviction units that are too infrequent in this country. We're going to have to mandate some reforms here. I just don't believe that we can rely on the goodwill of the people who have been elected, particularly when they've acted as irresponsibly as they've acted in Mr. Hinton's case.
I mean, explain that. In one of the murders that took place of a fast food manager, Anthony was 15 miles away working in a place that was locked up so you couldn't get out. And also this polygraph test.
Yes. So, yeah, there were 3 crimes, actually. They only charged him with the 2 murders, but there was a 3rd crime where the surviving victim, there was a surviving victim, and that took place at a Quincy's restaurant in Bessemer. Mr. Hinton, the crime took place around 12:15 in the morning. Mr. Hinton was working at a Bruno's warehouse, a supermarket warehouse. He clocked in at 11:57 p.m. He was seen by the security guard going in. His supervisor gave him his work instructions for the night, a guy named Tom Dahl, at 12:10. The supervisor saw him repeatedly over the next several hours. There was no way that he could have committed this crime. And they knew that. They absolutely knew that. But because they had this gun and this false testimony, they decided to persist. They gave him a polygraph. He passed the polygraph. They said that the car that was used in this crime was a big Oldsmobile, a big Buick that had been reclaimed. He didn't own a car like that. He was driving a small a Nissan. And they just ignored all of that. And that's where this presumption of guilt that gets assigned to black and brown people became a barrier. If he had been presumed innocent, no reasonable jury would have convicted him.
You mentioned
guilty.
You mentioned a integrity conviction unit. What do you mean by this? Mm-hmm.
There are some offices that have basically made a commitment to begin looking at cases where there is evidence of innocence. We've got, our prison population has gone from 300,000 in 1972 to 2.3 million people today. There's never been a time in America when we have more innocent people in jails and prisons than we have right now. We've invested in prisons, we've invested in policing, we've invested in prosecutors, we've invested in judges. We have not invested in the defense function to protect people from wrongful convictions. They don't have a right to counsel, they can't get to court. So only when you create these units can you really push the state to take seriously these claims. There's a prosecutor in Dallas that has done this. There's some places across the country where if you have compelling evidence that you've been wrongly convicted, they will initiate the investigation. That does not exist in Alabama. It doesn't exist in most states, but it needs to, given the incredible evidence that we have that there are so many wrongly convicted and condemned people in our jails and prisons.
Anthony Ray Hinton, can you describe the cell you were held in for nearly 30 years?
Yes, it's 5 by 7. You have a bed that is mounted to the wall. You have your toilet, and you got mesh wire in front of the cell. You got a little slot where they bring you your trays. The floors is concrete. You don't have no ventilation for air. It was dark, but now they had put some lights, come through it and fix the lights. So it's just the smallest cell, the smallest room you can imagine being on death row.
The way people were killed on your death row, how many in the time that you were on death row, and what were the methods used?
When I was there, first got there in '87, the method was primarily the electric chair. And it was about 30 yards, I would say, from my cell. And the next morning, by using the electric chair, you could actually smell the flush of the person that they had executed that night before. So they probably executed maybe 20, 25 in the electric chair and a few in the with the gurney.
Bryan Stevenson, the Equal Justice Initiative published a major report that we talked to you about, Lynching in America, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror. Do you see a connection between lynching and death row?
I do. I think that there's a narrative of racial difference that emerged in this country, actually during the time of slavery. When Mr. Hinton and I got together this morning, we paused outside our office where we have these signs that talk about the slave trade. And we dehumanized people of color, we demonized them, we said that they were different, we said that they were dangerous, we said that we could own them to civilize them, and that narrative of racial difference was never really confronted. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't deal with it, the 13th Amendment didn't deal with it, and then we had these decades of lynching, of terrorism directed at African Americans, because that same presumption of dangerousness and guilt made people comfortable doing horrific things to people during the course of these lynchings. When the federal government threatened to intervene again in the South, there was great pressure to move the lynchings indoor, and that was really the beginning of the modern death penalty. The short, unreliable, meaningless trials where people were presumed guilty and quickly sentenced to death. And that legacy of inadequate justice that begins with the Scottsboro Boys and continues in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and was on display in the 1980s when Mr. Hinton was wrongly convicted, has never really been challenged. And so, yes, I don't understand why the state of Alabama, who has killed so many people of color wrongly, the bodies of thousands of black men and women are buried in the ground where we are sitting as a result of racial injustice and bigotry and ignorance. And yet we persist. Our death penalty, 84% of the people who have been executed by capital punishment in this state are black. We have a death penalty that's racially biased in so many ways. The prosecutor who prosecuted Mr. Hinton had been reversed several times for intentionally excluding, in an illegal manner, African Americans from serving on juries. And yet he was allowed to keep prosecuting cases. We've got 65% of all murder victims in this state are black, but 80% of the people on death row are there for crimes involving victims who are white. The evidence of racial bias is so extreme and so overwhelming, and yet we do nothing. And you can't understand that without understanding lynching, without understanding slavery, without understanding segregation. And we won't overcome these problems until we start talking about these issues differently. And I hope that Mr. Hinton's case can really begin the kind of soul-searching and honest dialogue that we need to have, not only about our biased criminal justice system, but about the way we tolerate inequality and unfair treatment of the poor and people of color.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. Bryan Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative, attorney who represented Anthony Ray Hinton since 1999. And Anthony Ray Hinton, thank you so much for being with us. And congratulations on your freedom.
Thank you.
When we come back, believe it or not, we're going to speak about the case of another man on death row, yes, for 30 years. His name is Glen Ford. He now lays dying of cancer, but as a free man. His prosecutor, the lead prosecutor in the 1984 case that led to Glen Ford being sentenced to death, is now speaking out. We ask you to take a listen to what he says as we go to Shreveport, Louisiana. Stay with us.